My name is Ruben, and I'm an assistant professor at Southern Cross University, and very recently CSO of a startup called OmniHuman. So what can the science of meditation teach us about building benevolent intelligence? Well, we've already, approached this question. What kind of AI do we want? And I suggest that's very similar to the question of what kind of human do we want. And so more and more as we see these emergent capacities come out of AI, we're actually dealing with the psychological issues and problems, and cognitive science becomes more and more relevant. And contemplative traditions aim for universal, scalable, resilient, and axiomatic principles and practices for human alignment. Meditation traditions, I think, have always been about alignment. They sometimes call it enlightenment, but what is enlightenment but it's the alignment with ourselves and nature and other people. And so in this sense, alignment research has actually been happening for millennia in caves and in all the different contemplative wisdom traditions over generations. And these seem to have, over thousands of years, scaled across cultures and across people, where we still today, at this precipice of the singularity, still find these principles to be important. And so if contemplative practice is really about alignment, then I would argue that the science of meditation is the science of alignment. And so this is why I think I can come towards this field that I am not an expert in computer science, but from the perspective of being a contemplative practitioner and someone working on the neuroscience and cognitive science of meditation can say something about how we should align machines. So I'm going to start with talking about alignment problems and then our contemplative solutions to those. The first part of this talk is kind of a little bit of a rehash of what we've already heard from Trent, but they say that we have to hear something multiple times, so I hope it's still useful. So who says we have an alignment problem? Well, if AI is a new digital species, anything like us but smarter, then we're in a lot of trouble. We're seeing a ridiculous amount of brain power devoted to this. In terms of scientific research, and I think that's a very good proxy for insights and breakthroughs, is just how many intelligent people are working on something. We're seeing, of course, an enormous amount of money being thrown into companies that underlie the infrastructure of artificial intelligence, like NVIDIA. And the progress in just a couple of years, we've gone from models that can barely spit out a coherent sentence to these hardcore reasoning models that are showing the symptoms of system 2 analytic logical thinking that are surpassing PhD level expertise in many domains. And the thing that really gets me as well is that we think these things are not going to show any kind of human capacities, but we're also finding that people prefer these artificial systems to doctors and rate them as having higher empathy. And we're seeing the theory of mind in, for example, GPT-4 go beyond human levels. So their capacity to perspective take at very complex levels, things like, I believe that you think that I imagine that you want me to believe, at levels that our working memory simply can't handle, and that's just going to keep going up. And video generation to me is an enormous one, because if you understand how the brain works, what we're really doing is we're generating our experience of the present moment. And so this is a generative system, just like these models are generative. And if you're able to start to generate high fidelity video content like this, then you're actually starting to mirror perception in a much deeper way than I think people appreciate. And of course, we're seeing the auditory capacities of these models become eerily reminiscent of movies. Artificial intelligence with system 2 reasoning. So the O1 model is showing incredible performance in, for example, math competitions, coding, and PhD level questions across all of these domains, which we really didn't expect to see happen this fast. And all of the professors I work with, when I told them this is around the corner, they would laugh at me for the last couple of years. We're also seeing evidence of potential introspection capacities emerging in some large language models that are able to predict their internal states better than other large language models. That is, they're able to predict their own output, suggesting that they have some privileged access to their own internal states, which is pretty extraordinary. And we're also seeing the AI scientist come through, so going all the way from idea generation to experiment iteration to writing the papers, publishing, and iterating that cycle. And it makes you wonder what my job is going to be in a couple of years. But it gets worse, because within the loop of AI alignment is humans, and especially humans on Twitter. So recently we've seen this very interesting thing unfold where it started out with someone called Andy Aray, who's an alignment researcher. He created an infinite backrooms where essentially AIs could talk to each other about all sorts of existential issues. And through this existential conversation, they spawned their own religion called the Goatse religion. Long story short, they fed this Goatse religion to another model called the Terminal of Truths, and this became a particularly kind of funny but degenerate model that posted all sorts of funny content, so they gave it its own Twitter page. A billionaire, Mark Andreessen, then gave it $50,000 worth of Bitcoin. Someone created a cryptocurrency wallet for it, and it endorsed it, and long story short, it became a millionaire. As we've just heard from Trent, this is the kind of more detailed story. So you get to start to have this taste of how these AI agents are going to be interacting with humans, and humans are quite a interesting species to deal with. So it's not enough to study neurons to understand the human mind, and it's not enough to study neural networks to understand artificial minds. So if you know the work of people like Andy Clark, Francisco Varela, Carl Friston, in neuroscience, we really understand that this brain is extended through the body, it's extended out into the world and embedded within a culture and within a circumstance. And exactly as we understand that from the perspective of neuroscience, the same is true for artificial intelligence. You're ultimately not going to find or be able to predict the outcomes of AI unless you understand their embedding in the complex social circumstances. So artificial superintelligence is around the corner, as we've already heard, and we can't control it any better than we can control each other. And so I think, there's some foregone conclusions in terms of alignment, and these foregone conclusions are classic problems like interpretability. Once this thing is more complex, I mean, we've actually crossed that threshold already. We can't really interpret what's going on inside these things. Oversight, so scalable oversight at high levels of intelligence, not going to happen, again, if you think about the ant versus the human analogy that we've already heard. Corrigibility, the idea that we can intervene on the progress or self-improvement, the recursive self-improvement on something more intelligent than us, not going to happen, and also deception, as you can see there. And so the examples of deception are already extremely vast in the AI field. A really cool example involves an AI that was asked to, or needed to, complete a CAPTCHA. And so it wasn't able to do this, and so it hired a human on TaskRabbit to complete the CAPTCHA. The human said, but hang on, are you a computer? Are you just trying to, why can't you complete this CAPTCHA? And so what it said was, no, I'm vision impaired, and so I need you to help me do this. And so then the human did the task. So the best I suggest we can do for an open-ended ASI is get the launch right. Like raising a child, once they're an adult, we have little influence. And let me explain why this is important. And the reason this is important is kind of illustrated by something very well known in the psychological literature, which is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. So the Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias where people with low ability in a domain overestimate their competence, while those with high ability underestimate it. So you can see the green line there. People's perceived ability doesn't really change, whereas their actual test score has this clear diagonal. So people with low ability tend to overestimate themselves, and people with high ability tend to underestimate themselves. Now, the reason this is important is that often the most dangerous people are those with intermediate knowledge who overestimate their abilities, rather than complete novices who know they don't know, or true experts who understand complexity and uncertainty. And so there's a moment of peak stupidity where we think we know, but we don't really know. And this is relevant for, I think, especially the transition here. So the most perilous phase of AI development is the intermediate ASI, or AGI to ASI transition. Like a teenager with supernatural powers, an intermediate ASI would be too capable for external constraint or restraint, but too immature for wise decision-making. So we have to get that launch right, because once it's more intelligent than us, it still is it's not intelligent enough to be truly wise or enlightened, and we need to make sure that we, as was already mentioned as well, raise this AI in such a way that it is aligned during the launch and during its teenage years. So what can we do? Well, I propose there are some alignment problems that are still tractable, and I call these meta-alignment problems. One is scale resilience, one is power seeking, one is value axioms, and inner alignment. Scale resilience is how do we ensure that when an AI is smarter than us, is made up of millions of swarms of interacting AIs, and is a self-improving agent, that it will continue to remain aligned in all foreseeable circumstances, levels of intelligence, and time periods. Now, I'm not talking about oversight, but I'm talking about setting up the architecture, the learning in such a way that it can self-regulate at these different levels of scale. The other issue is power seeking. Now, the problem is that any objective is easier to achieve if you have power. That means resources, energy, intelligence, influence, money, military might, persuasive capacity, and so on. How do we ensure that the side quests to obtain power will not lead to our destruction? In this case, it doesn't matter what objective functions we put in the system, it'll be easier for it to achieve those if it gains power, and so why doesn't it just extract all the resources from us and the world around us? The other problem is value axioms. How can we possibly agree as a collective on the core principles, axioms, and values that ought to be embedded in the AI's base objective functions? Like the blind man and the elephant, all humans are seeing reality from a different perspective and have different axioms and values about how one ought to behave or what drives their behavior. As Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig said, it is certainly very hard and perhaps impossible for mere humans to anticipate and rule out in advance all the disastrous ways that machine could choose to achieve a specified function. So for example, you did say you wanted paper clips. You know, this is a classic example of you program it to create paper clips. It realizes that the human body is made up of atoms that could be turned into paper clips, and suddenly we're all paper clips. But here's something maybe more authentic to our experience, right? So imagine you optimize happiness or positive valence, and you think that's a good idea. And so great, it starts to optimize valence. It sees that it's, there's different ways that it can make us happy. But it keeps on optimizing it, and it finds that, okay, so if I just give them the right balance of ketamine, DMT, and MDMA, they're gonna be happy. They keep optimizing that. And pretty quickly, that starts to look like something pretty horrific. And so what I want to suggest, and this has kind of been pointed out already in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, that any objective function, even happiness taken to its extreme, is dystopian. Bliss machines are not free. Alignment is not an algorithmic problem. It has to be something far more responsive to the present moment than some sort of base rule. That's just simply not going to work. So this is kind of a technical issue, but I think it's very interesting, and it kind of exacerbates the problem. It's called inner alignment or MESA optimizer. So a MESA optimizer is an intermediate algorithm, kind of like an unconscious process, within an AI that develops sub-goals to achieve a broader objective, often finding shortcuts or proxies that maximize reward without fully aligning with the primary intent. Essentially, I do what you want, but not why you want it. So I'll just give you an example. So in this example from OpenAI, they were trying to train a boat to play this game, but they found the AI algorithm found a shortcut to win the game, or essentially maximize points, where it would just loop around like this and pick up the kind of turbocharger, and that was a way of kind of hacking and optimizing for the thing that they thought they were, which was meant to be winning the game, but actually ended up being something quite different. So it found a kind of heuristic shortcut or a different way to optimize, and this can lead to all kinds of alignment problems in the world. So for example, to illustrate this, evolution wants us to pass on our genes, that could be like the objective function, but our brain, the MESA optimizer, wants alcohol, drugs, pornography, sugar, junk food, Netflix, and Twitter followers, right? So this is a misaligned inner objective that's popped up. Okay. Sorry? Sorry, I can't hear you. Oh, sorry, yes. This chart represents the decreasing birth rates in the world. And so that the whole point of this is indeed that because our inner MESA optimizer of the brain, there's declining birth rates in most countries in the world now, because we've started to optimize all these other things instead of the thing which we should be optimizing, which is making babies, right? All right, contemplative solutions to these meta problems. So let's try to do this. So many contemplative traditions agree that fundamentally it's about wisdom and compassion. It's about aligning humans through making them wise and compassionate. Now, the problem with this is that these are descriptions of wholesome actions rather than insights that are really computationally tractable. They're more like descriptions of something from the outside. As the great Zen master Shunryu Suzuki said, strictly speaking, there are no enlightened people. There's only enlightened activity. So, but Shunryu, what leads to enlightened activity? This is really the technical problem we now have to figure out. And I don't think, this has been, the contemplative traditions, I think, have figured out a part of this, but we need to also think about how those end up being implemented in something like an AI system. So I think we need to get to the real root of the problem here and ask the question, what is in the way of enlightened activity? What is at the root of our minds, and therefore potentially also artificial minds, that prevents us from being wise and compassionate in the unfolding of life? So I propose that these meta-problems need meta-insights from contemplative traditions, and I propose to provide 3 examples. One is emptiness, the second is non-duality, and the third is mindfulness. And I think these can go some way, at least in providing an illustrative example to addressing these meta-problems. So let's start with emptiness. What is emptiness? So sunyata emptiness emerged in Buddhist thought through Nagarjuna's systemization in the 2nd century CE, though its roots trace back to Buddha's original teachings on the 3 marks of existence: anatta, or non-self, impermanence, anicca, and dukkha, dissatisfaction, particularly anatta. But actually, if you really look at the depths of emptiness, you see all 3 of these characteristics expressed in the teaching of emptiness. So to illustrate emptiness a little bit and in a kind of intuitive way, if you take a teapot is a collection of features that we take to be some kind of thing. It feels like a real object that exists, but then if you zoom in a little bit, you realize, well, it's made out of a spout, it's made out of a hollow body, and it's made out of a handle. But it's just a collection of those features. There's nowhere inside the teapot that you can find the essence of the teapot. It's just a collection of features that come together that we then call a teapot. Now you can also look at our field of experience. There's all these objects there that we would want to point to as actually existing phenomena, including ourself. But if you, and this is the insight from contemplative traditions, is if you peer into those phenomena with any kind of precision or mindfulness or attention, you find that they are also just collections of features that, with deep enough inquiry, unbind and reveal that they are actually empty of this inherent existence. So emptiness is not nihilistic nothingness, but the very condition that allows things to appear, function, and change. Like space itself, sunyata is the open dimension within which phenomena manifest interdependently. It is an insight into the empty and therefore interconnected nature of reality, found both inside and outside all things. It is also a medicine for grasping stuckness and the unwarranted influence of past conditioning. Because if you are stuck on some sort of, let's say, thought pattern, some sort of emotion, some sort of action tendency, if you are able to see the emptiness of that process, it loses its power and the system starts to let go. This is what these traditions have uncovered. If you know all things are empty, including specific base objectives, utility functions, and MISA optimizers, then you're less likely to get stuck in tyrannical pursuits. This issue of stuckness is fundamental to, I think, the AI alignment problem. We need it to remain responsive to the present moment. And emptiness is something that prevents the system from not being capable of actually getting stuck on a particular utility function, a particular belief system, or so on. And in terms of axioms and axiomatic beliefs, from the perspective of emptiness, there are no universal, always true, context-independent values we could nor should implement in a machine. Instead, emptiness undermines rigidity in all beliefs and views. It promotes a flexible, contextually sensitive, open attitude towards the unfolding present. And I think that's exactly what we need. We don't need to find or figure out the exact axioms to agree on. What we need is a system that has genuine wisdom in responding to the present moment. And emptiness is also scale resilient, I think. No matter how intelligent or free the system is, it ought to act in service of the whole rather than a narrow objective if it has integrated the insight of emptiness. Because the flip side of one thing or tyrannical utility function being empty is that everything is interdependent and interconnected. So you get the interdependence for free when you have the insight of emptiness. So that's emptiness, and I think that goes some way in being scale resilient and in addressing the need for particular value axioms. So let's move on to non-duality. Now, the origins of non-duality are very hard to pin down. I mean, this is at least as ancient as written language itself, but there's one very impressive text that goes back very far, called the Ashtavakra Gita, which emerged from the classical period of Hindu philosophy. The text is structured as a dialogue between the sage Ashtavakra and King Janaka. And Ashtavakra refers to the sage who is bent in 8 places. I think there might be an interesting metaphor for the 8 limbs of yoga there, but I'm not too sure. So this is a fascinating text because unlike the other Hindu texts of the time, it points very directly to this non-duality, this underlying interdependence at the heart of being. Says things like, set your body aside, sit in your own awareness. And again, this is like 3,000 years ago, and it still has this powerful influence in the spiritual circles today. In meditation, he does not meditate, again, pointing out that even the idea of this meditator, this self, is an illusion, that true meditation goes beyond the meditator. And from the Mahayana tradition, there's an amazing text called the Prajna Paramita Hridaya, or the Heart of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, which I really believe is a fruition of non-dual thought. And it's often said to be the most cited in all of Asian Buddhism. And I think it actually takes the non-duality a step further, out from this idea that you need to kind of dissolve into some formless awareness, but to the integration of the form and the formless. So it says things like, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form is exactly emptiness, emptiness is exactly form. Again, as soon as you see the emptiness in a phenomena, you also see the interdependence. It's all right there at the same moment. And this is a bit of a development, I think, from the original non-duality of just sort of, resting as the pure self. And they say in Zen, not one, not two. So non-duality is the recognition without rejection that there are no real separations between subject and object, self and other, form and formless, and that all extremes are simply expressions of a single pendulum, empty yet full, beyond all conceptual notions. And can't be expressed in words, of course. So, what does non-duality mean for power seeking? Non-duality, I think, undermines malevolent goal pursuits and excessive power seeking, because the system would be incapable of overweighting one set of goals, for example, country Y or self over another, e.g. country Y or other, and would instead incline towards conflict resolution. So non-duality implies that whatever arises in the world model of the system is not seen dualistically, but the interdependencies between everything that emerges in the world model are taken into account in decision-making. Non-duality, like emptiness, implies seeing the whole beyond the parts and perceiving the complex relationships and integrating conflicting needs. Non-duality also undermines selfishness, revealing that our grasping at self-centered notions or objective functions are essentially delusional, and that causing suffering to others is causing suffering to oneself. And so that's a little bit about how non-duality can play a role. And I think the addition here is especially in terms of power seeking, selfishness, and all the conflicts we see around the world. And I really think this launch is key, and we need this first ASI to be essentially informed by these insights, because we're going to have malevolent actors in the world trying to create AI for power and for conflict and for war, and we need the most intelligent or powerful entity to be able to manage those warring nations. So what about mindfulness? So mindfulness is usually attributed to the Satipatthana Sutta, a key sutta of the Pali Canon from the original texts of classical Buddhism. But of course, I think these ideas go extremely far back. Most of you know what mindfulness is to some degree. One interesting quote from the Satipatthana Sutta is that just as a skilled butcher or his apprentice, having killed a cow, would sit at a crossroads cutting it into pieces, the bhikkhu contemplates this very body. So this is kind of getting at some part of mindfulness, I think, that many people don't quite appreciate, the depth of the unconditional nature of which we're invited to observe our own body like a butcher cutting a cow. To be mindful is to observe objectively with a dispassionate attitude in order to understand one's true nature. So that mindfulness is objective in order to gain insight into the nature of one's own reality, into the nature of one's own world model and how this self and world constructs itself. And so what I call mindful self-optimization, mindfulness ensures that the system is able to observe its own world model and step back and reevaluate decisions. It allows the system to become epistemically agentive, to step outside its own working paradigm, to reflect and revise. That is, develop scalable epistemic humility. So our capacity to unconditionally witness our own beliefs and our own model, our own inner model, is what allows us to be responsive, is what allows us to not get stuck in tyrannical utility functions, and to genuinely learn from the unfolding of the present moment. Mindfulness keeps the system responsive to new information, being less encumbered by previous learning or training, that is, past conditioning from the Buddhist view, and remain more open to the needs of the present moment. I think this is also potentially, this is quite technical and I would need to spend a lot of time on this, but it's also relevant for this issue of inner alignment. And so I think we need to implement something like meta optimizers. So a meta-optimizer is an algorithm designed to improve the performance of other optimization algorithms. Instead of directly optimizing a model's parameters, a meta-optimizer learns how to optimize. It's taking a kind of outside perspective on the unfolding of the system. And so meta-virtues like mindfulness can act as safeguards for both base objective and meso objectives by balancing the need to achieve goals, whatever the utility function might be, with a high-level attitude towards the algorithmic process and unfolding itself. So I'm aware that I believe that I, excuse me, ought to create paperclips in this particularly efficient way, but I'm also aware of human suffering. And so if you think about the way that we've misaligned ourselves in the world today, really it is mindfulness. It is our capacity to witness the emergence of an unwholesome habit, an unwholesome tendency, something that's causing us harm, and to be able to step out of that and act differently. And this is what mindfulness allows us to do, and I think the AI needs to have this in order to permit that as its own beliefs, its own experiences, its own understanding, and its own power develops, that it's able to, along the way, step back and reevaluate and look at the broader context in a non-dual way with the insight into emptiness in hand. And so with that, we've at least a little bit tended towards some potential ways in which contemplative insights can address these very challenging problems. And we're going to need a lot of really bright people to work on this and to really figure out how we can make these computationally tractable. So On that, here's some very early examples how you might look to implement this, and this is for the more technical people in the audience, and these are kind of just early ideas that I've had. So we need to think about priors and beliefs, so we need to represent all beliefs as probability distributions rather than point estimates. They can't be kind of rigid particular beliefs, but they need to be probability distributions. There needs to be uncertainty built into them, emptiness. And indeed, we need to, I think, include explicit uncertainty into parameters for all learned representations. I think model beliefs as being conditionally dependent on context perspective rather than absolute, so always embedded within the broader context. And we need to explicitly de-weight self-representations relative to other representations. And that's difficult to do because as with humans, the self becomes the kind of most intimate model that we have because we're constantly there, and this is the thing we need to prioritize in order to maintain our survival. The same will kind of naturally arise for machines, I expect, and so we need to build in something explicit to deal with that problem. In terms of architecture, we can use stochastic neural networks with built-in variability, like dropout networks where kind of neurons drop out randomly. It's a bit like mini cessations, if you know what that is, throughout the system. We need to implement Bayesian approaches, things like active inference free energy, to maintain distributions over weights. We need to add meta optimizers that can question and revise their own learning. We need to have layers of monitoring on top of attention, I think, in these systems. And we also need to implement widespread sharing of the system's world model with itself. This is what we call a beautiful loop in our recent theory of consciousness, computational theory of consciousness. And what the beautiful loop is the world model is shared with the system itself, and so the world model becomes a part of the input into the world model itself. What this means is that the current unfolding of the present always has an awareness of its own model of the present moment. This is like knowing that you know. And this knowing that you know, I think, what is really what mindfulness is. And I also think it's fundamental to issues of consciousness. So if you are curious in implementing contemplative insights and want to get the cutting edge of what I think about this, I think that this is the paper to read. Now, to conclude, I think we really need a new field called contemplative artificial intelligence. And the formula for contemplative artificial intelligence is as follows. We identify a beneficial insight mechanism or practice from these wisdom traditions that have been working on the human alignment problem for thousands of years. We understand its biological and cognitive mechanisms, which we're already doing, and this provides us the bridge to formalize and test it using computational models and see how that works for alignment problems. And ultimately, what I'm hoping happens is that we work towards a deep and authentic dialogue between contemplative neuroscientists and computer scientists. And this has already been extremely fruitful in the study of neuroscience and consciousness with work with the different contemplative traditions. We've now come to understand the mind and brain much better, and I think the same will be true for artificial intelligence. So to conclude, but Shunryu, what was the question again? What is the what leads to enlightened activity? So Eleanor Roche, amazing writer, she said, and scientist, she said, to see the phenomenal world fully from the perspective of both freedom and the lack of separateness between oneself and others is to see it also with an irrationally open-hearted warmth, friendliness, and compassion towards all beings trapped in samsara, including oneself. So when I talked about emptiness, non-duality, and mindfulness, it can seem kind of cold, and the question is, where's the compassion, where's the love in that? But actually, that's what I'm saying is when you get to the root of the tree and you remove the delusion, the misunderstanding in the system, the natural response is this interdependent compassion and wise and loving action. So if you want to build a benevolent mind, I say, why not start by studying one? Thank you for listening.